So, welcome back, everybody. Welcome to Theme 5. So, my name is Fortunate Ma Chingura, and I'm supposed to be chairing this session with Julian, who couldn't travel today, but I will aim to represent us well. So in this session, we are aiming to explore the intersection of new research, emerging technologies, and the ethical frameworks that must guide their development and application. And I've got three amazing speakers, and two of them I had the pleasure to sit with in the group discussions for the past day. So at the crux of this discussion is the speed of climate change, coupled with the destructive power of extreme climate events such as heat waves, flooding, wildfires, and hurricanes. And this has thrust us into a world where new scenarios outlined by scientists and the media underscore the urgency of finding solutions and doing so fast. This sense of urgency is driving both mitigation and adaptation efforts. Yesterday in my presentation, I spoke about adaptation not happening, at least as fast as we need. And I had the pleasure of discussing with Kyle last night, and he said, no, adaptation is happening. But it just depends on who defines adaptation and what is happening. Back home, we call them coping strategies. And he said those are adaptation strategies as well. But the thing is, to us, these adaptation solutions should come even sooner. And this sense of urgency is driving both mitigation and adaptation efforts, perhaps slowly than we would like. The sense of urgency should propose solutions that work for local context, whether technological or policy-based. Most of them remain untested, with outcomes that are deeply uncertain. And the question is, how do we balance the necessity for speed with the responsibility to proceed cautiously? What should guide our decision-making when the risks of inaction are perhaps catastrophic, but the risks of misapplied solutions are equally profound? The search for answers will demand not only innovation, but also commitment to justice, inclusivity, and transparency. And again, at the center of that is whose voices are being heard, who defines the risks, and who defines the benefits. To help us navigate these pressing issues, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished experts. Dr. Ignacio Mastrolia, the philosopher. Yes. He will bring his expertise on the governance of emerging technologies and the frameworks for balancing innovation with ethical accountability. Welcome, Doctor. Then there's Delphine Thesi, a renowned advocate for participatory research. She will offer insights into inclusive approaches that center the voices of affected communities in decision-making process. Welcome, Delphine. And we have Matimba Swana, an expert in climate and health policy, and she will challenge us to consider how health equity can guide the development and deployment of climate adaptation strategies. Welcome, Matimba. And together, they will help us reflect on the ethical factors that must be considered when balancing urgency and caution in researching new technologies to address climate change and health. And most importantly, colleagues, we would like to understand whose voices must shape our decisions. How can we ensure that innovation is not only rapid, but also just and equitable? So let's dive into this discussion. I would like to welcome Dr. Ignacio to come and do his presentation. Please help me to applaud. Thanks.
Thank you, Fortunate. Okay, hi everyone. I will do a little cheat now. Okay, in the name of mental health, let's say. If you are experiencing certain levels of climate anxiety, now this is going to rocket your levels of climate anxiety. So it may be a good idea to go and take coffee or whatever. This is based on personal experience working on this topic. I'm not kidding you. Having said that, okay, it works. Doesn't work. Okay, perfect. So some veracity check. I have a very, very limited knowledge of medicine and public health and a very, 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 very limited knowledge of climate science. So the challenge, we just talk about this a lot, but this is another slide that shows we are not doing good. Climate intervention, planetary scale deployment of stratospheric aerosol injection to actively cool the Earth's surface. What is that? It's a methodology inspired in volcanoes like Mount Pinatubo, and stratospheric aerosol injection is a type of solar radiation modification, SRM, which is the technical name, or solar geoengineering, SG. I will be using these acronyms, SRM, SG. So the technology for stratospheric aerosol injection, planetary deployment, does not exist, but is technically doable. And it may be the maybe the most studied and most feasible in terms of effectiveness, cost, and timeliness. And it's a band-aid, it's a technofix, it doesn't solve the problem of CO2. And then you have some facts over there. The cost is 20 billion per year per 1 Celsius degree of cooling the Earth, which if you compare with the figures Fortunate was telling us only for health, which were in the 15 trillion or something like that, you will start understanding the incentives for doing this. And the duration, if you deploy this, would be of decades or more. And the amount is in 1 million tons per year per 0.5 C. So are we on our way to planetary sci? Let's talk about SCOPEX, small scale outdoor experiment. What is SCOPEX? So think of this small gondola, and this is kind of an explanation. And what it does is throws some aerosol, like hours or days, and the amount is just 1 or 2 kilos. So the detailed scope is for stratospheric control perturbation experiment. The PI is Frank Koich, sponsored Harvard Solar Geoengineering Research Program, funded by private foundations and individual. Main aim, research. Immediate risk, no significant. Mediate risk, it may have significant deterrent of ambition, mitigation, adaptation policies, also known as moral hazard. And a little detail about the aerosols that were designed. You have sulfur or sulfur dioxide, SO2, which is naturally occurring in the stratosphere, like Mount Pinatubo, human-generated pollution, well, not naturally, but already we know about this. And you may also have this more experimental and questionable calcium carbonate, which is in eggshells, and it was proposed to be thrown. But so an abbreviated chronology. SCOPEX was first proposed in 2014. And this is a very important thing if you are thinking about research ethics. It was an experiment explicitly related to planetary use of psi. And this is different from a marine cloud brightening experiment to protect the Australian marine, because the objective, it's not planetary deployment and it's regional. And there was a cancellation in 2021 of a test flight in Sweden without aerosol release. And Swedish environmental organizations and the Sami Council, representing the Sami indigenous people, multinational of the Arctic region, asked Harvard to suspend site research there and everywhere. And the causes explaining this were different visions of SRM research, deployment funding, as well as inadequate community engagement with the Sami Council. But I list at least 3 confounders. The Sami have a long history of regional eugenic health policies and discrimination, but the member states where they live, like Sweden. Another confounder is the participation of anti-SRM groups like the etc. group, which is very important to take into account. And the third confounder, SCOPS, was privately funded and not publicly funded, so this may add. So in the end, Harvard halted SCOPEX in March 2024. So let's do some bioethical analysis. The framework I will use is a framework we have been developing that is based on fundamental questions. And what I want to focus here is that the tags, definition, justification, ethical criteria, and governance are different. So they have a function. So you should not ask your definitions to do the work of your justification and not justification to do the work of criteria, etc. So let's start. What is a solar geoengineering experiment? We need to distinguish between 2 things. Small-scale research, which is SCOPEX, which the main aim is to learn or generate knowledge, reduce uncertainty, and something like an experimental cooling scheme, like make sunsets, which is deployment, small scale, and the main aim is to do something or benefit others. That's the main stated there. So, and what we defend, or I defend here, is that setting the definitions is the first step of ethics and governance. You have to start with definitions. Even the definitions should not be biased and should be neutral. You should start with this. And so what is SCOPEX? SCOPEX is an exemplary case of outdoor small-scale solar geoengineering research. I won't get into details here, but I think this is the most important slide I will show you, because it gives you the autonomy to think about this technology. Is small-scale outdoor research ethically permissible? There are all sorts of positions. It's considered ethically permissible by authoritative international research ethics guidelines. It's considered mandatory, or could be considered mandatory, but significant authors. So it's a moral imperative to do research and talk about this. And it's considered ethically forbidden by a group also of social research and climate researchers, that group around the non-use agreement, and some other anti-SRM groups like the ETC group or the Heinrich Böll Foundation. What I want to highlight here is that there is a common ground. All voices have valid fears, and it would be imprudent to disregard those fears. Should low and middle income countries host small outdoor research? ethical permissibility does not solve this issue. We should produce reasons in favor or against. It is a fact that the high-income countries are or will be the main developers of this technology and may be sustaining it for decades because they are the ones who can do this. And hence, the low middle income country has both ethical and strategic reasons to host small outdoor research or to refuse them. So, but this is something. Okay, did scopes have adequate community engagement and research governance? No. And that's this is a paper from the advisory committee, and I would suggest you to read it for the details, but I think there is consensus from all parts that there was no adequate. What is adequate community engagement? That's the interesting question. So, are indigenous voices necessary against solar geoengineering? No. That's another statement of fact, or kind of. Indigenous and non-indigenous people could be either against or in favor of this. These are some examples. There is a very interesting example of the marine crowd blightening, California, University of Washington, where people from the city council of Alameda, they canceled, and it was a similar risk profile with no risk, and they canceled it. And they were considered there was no adequate community engagement, and it's a non-indigenous people, let's say. So the take-home lesson is: do not reify human behavior. Beware of treating people's views as inherent characteristic of individual groups and not part of a dynamic socio-economical and political relationships. Individuals and groups behave in a complex, multiple, and strategic ways. We need to be careful when assigning unidimensional identities leads to single attitudes. This does not characterize the richness of social life and individual of collective behavior. This is from Renzo Tadei, Brazilian anthropologist that is part of a network we collaborate. So what are the democratic society's duties against misinformation? Democratic states have a duty to research to comply with basic interests of the common good and for the population. And hence they have a duty to protect themselves from misinformation. And this is misinformation for any side, for anti, pro, or whatever technology. And all human beings have a right of a social and international order that defends the rights of the Declaration of Human Beings. Lessons on responsible innovation. This is from the sources Apprentice Goethe, popularized by Disney Fantasia short film. We should be wary of the help or technology or spirits we summon because we may not be able to control it. This is the negative lesson from Goethe's Apprentice Sorcerer poem. But there is also a positive lesson, which is the old master's lesson. And that is that if we are going to summon a powerful technology, spirit, or help, we should develop our character, our ethical character, and our scientific science. So these are the two final lessons on responsible innovation. So thank you very much. And a little bit of recognition to the funders and a special recognition to the team of Flaxo and particularly to Ines Camilioni, which is an IPCC vice chair, and of course to Florencia Luna. He's here. We would not be here if it wasn't for her vision and her passion for bioethics. Thank you, Florencia.
Thank you. That was brilliant. Well done. So please note down your question, put it down, don't forget it, and then we'll discuss at the end of the 3 presentations. So, Thésée, should I please welcome on stage? Applause.
Thanks. So I'm a bit the imposter after the philosopher, because I'm actually probably one of the non-ethicists in the room. I'm a practitioner of stakeholder engagement, and I work on policy. And I'm actually replacing someone who would have been so much better than me doing this, Naima Sykes, who is the stakeholder engagement director. But I'll do my best to replace her. So I'm going to talk to you first about the perfect storm. And before I start, a bit of interaction. Can everyone who has had malaria before raise their hand at least once? Yeah, okay, we're in a global health meeting, so that's quite a number already. So for those who haven't had malaria, a few numbers. We have made big progresses. So if I had been giving this talk 20 years ago, I would be talking about millions of deaths every year. And now, let's say a good number is 600,000 deaths. Is that a good number compared to the millions? Yes, we've made big progress. But we still have a child dying every minute, mostly in Africa. 95% of cases are in Africa. And we're close to 250 million cases a year. So the deaths are obviously really dramatic, but 249 million cases are people not going to school, not being able to farm or do their daily life and thrive in life. So we've done big progress. We've went, as I say, from a million deaths to a bit over 500,000. But these progress are really threatened these days. We have a lot of threats, biological threats. The mosquitoes are becoming resistant. They're adapting to the control measures. The parasite is becoming resistant. It's adapting to the treatment. We have new invasive alien species, which is not about climate, but is also an environmental consideration. We have conflicts in a lot of countries that have high burden. And the other big risk that we are seeing more and more is that malaria is no longer a big priority. Oh, okay. Have to stay online. So yeah, it's no longer a big priority for donors, and so we are struggling every year a bit more to get the money to fund all these interventions. That's one part of the perfect storm. Second part of the perfect storm, as we're in a climate meeting, and you might have seen very often when people talk about climate and health, and they give malaria as an example. The reason is that it's highly impacted by extreme weather events. And I think the most telling example is Pakistan. As you might know, Pakistan had really big floods, and these floods led to a multiplication by 5 of the number of cases. That's not a small thing, if you can imagine, for the health system, for the burden on the country. And that's a country that had relatively low malaria. So they went from relatively low to big outbreak. The change of the weather patterns are affecting mosquito and the parasite developments. So it depends. It's not uniform across the globe. So you'll have some regions that will have less mosquitoes because they will become so dry that actually mosquito won't be able to live there, but likely people won't be able to live there either. Sorry, yeah, I'm continuing on the depressing talk. And other parts where we had low malaria or no malaria, for example, highlands, where we'll have more. It was estimated by the recent Lancet report that 17.1% of the global land area became suitable for transmission of Plasmodium falciparum, which is one of the main parasites, over the last 60 years. So more and more land where people are at risk. We see also a big change in seasonality. So in some region, it becomes a shorter season. And in some region where they had really seasonal malaria, African colleagues here might know, in some countries, you say, oh, we're getting to malaria season. The seasons are getting longer and longer because the rain patterns are changing. It's affecting a lot of the interventions. We have a lot of interventions that were seasonal, season dependent. So the one is actually called seasonal chemoprevention. So that means you need to know when the season's supposed to start, because that's when you're going to give the medicine to the children. So if you don't know when it starts, it becomes really difficult to do that. And then, of course, climate change has, as Fortunate says on the first day, it has a lot of other impacts on livelihood, on other things that are social, economic determinants of health. So if climate change impacts my livelihood, I'm going to have less access to health services, being less able to bring myself or my children to a health facility to get diagnosed. That's the second part of the perfect storm. And the last part is actually that because of climate change, our window to eliminate is shortening. So that's the kind of very depressing news. It's basically if we don't eliminate in the coming 50 years, we will never eliminate. Because by then, malaria will have won. Mosquitoes, the parasite, will be over such a large area that we won't be able to do anything. So that's our perfect storm. So I'm here to talk to you about one innovation that's been considered, on which the project Target Malaria is one example. There's like basically 4 main projects that work on this in Africa. All of the projects working on this technology are currently working in Africa because that's where the burden is. So very, very basic. I'm not a scientist, so I won't bore you with molecular biology details, but very basic about what that tool is. So for those who have done a bit of biology at some point and others, most of the genes in natural life are inherited 50% of the time. So you get a 50% chance to get a gene from your mother or your father. What a gene drive is the ability, it's a gene that has the ability to be inherited in a higher proportion. You can get up to 90, 95%. That's a naturally occurring phenomenon, but it can be replicated in the lab. It's a genetic modification. So this allows you to modify a wide population. You can change the population of mosquitoes because it allows you to spread that gene of interest that you might have. How it can be used, one example is you could spread a gene that will affect the ability of mosquitoes to reproduce. You could make them all male, for example, because male don't bite, and male are not really responsible for the survival of the species. That's in mosquitoes, but I'm not commenting on other species. Or you could affect female sterility, that's the female fertility, sorry, that's the way that Target Malaria is planning to do it. Other projects are looking at similar ways, but to affect the ability to transmit the parasite. What's to remember here, it's a genetically modified intervention, and it has the ability to modify a wide population. And in a way, if you start releasing it, the gene will start spreading. It spreads through reproduction, so it spreads through generations. So in theory, it can't be stopped once it's been released. So a little bit like the example before, the question is what's the limit, the difference between a trial and the beginning of a deployment. So what's the ethical dilemma? Well, there are many, but the one I wanted to talk to you about, which has been, so I used to be the director for engagement, and that was always what I was thinking about, and that was always kind of my first slide, is who decides and whose voice you have to listen to. So the dilemma we have is you have local communities. So malaria, so far, is mostly a rural disease. And so local rural community will be the ones experiencing it the most. They have the highest burden. And they have a sense of urgency. I have a colleague who usually gives this talk, and she's a survivor of malaria. She's a mother, and she says when your children, and it's mostly children under 5, when your child is sick, you do have a sense of urgency. You're ready to take any intervention. So local level, really high sense of urgency. These people don't have really high influence. They might not have really high literacy level. They don't have a lot of knowledge about environmental aspects, about biosafety, about genetics. Global level stakeholders, some are the same that for geoengineering, the ETC groups, but also more generally big environmental groups, as well as just policymaker at global level. They don't necessarily have a direct experience of malaria. We're privileged. I'm coming from Europe. I come from a country where malaria was eliminated more than 100 years ago. So I don't have a direct experience. And I have, in a way, the luxury to have the concerns. It's a new technology. It has the word genetic modification in it. So it brings all the baggage of what was done in that field before. And so I have all these concerns. I have concerns about ecosystem, what's going to happen when you reduce that species so much, what happens to the rest of the ecosystem, what happens when you modify the wild population. I should have said before, so gene drive exists in nature, but engineered gene drive, so man-made gene drive, have never been released for any use. And malaria is likely to be the first use case. And now I'm the decision maker. And the question is, who am I? So there's different level. There's the national decision maker, and they have to decide what level of oversight they're going to give to this science. They're going to have to decide whether they want to accelerate this research for urgency, or they want to delay it to make sure they have the right safeguards. And the big question we have is, and we have it at global level, we were at the COP Biodiversity where this gets discussed 3 weeks ago, and you have voices that say, oh, this is so powerful, potentially, that the decision should be at global level. Local level, countries, villages don't have the ability to make that decision. And we, in our group yesterday, we had a little bit of that where someone said, oh, but local communities, they are not literate, they can't make that decision, so bring it up to people who can. But when you say that, you are questioning whose voice you're listening to. Do you listen to voice of people burdened by the disease, but also potentially affected by the impact? Because for me, if I live in Europe, this is not going to affect me. Those mosquitoes won't come to me. The sick one and the modified one won't come to me. So you have this big question of global versus local governance and standards. And it's not unique to gene drive, and I thought that that's why we presented this paper here. We thought that this was a really good example to think through some of these questions for climate interventions as well, and health and climate. Because you have this question of where should the decision be, and I think Mike this morning mentioned, climate change is something where you need global action, and when you start there, you have the risk of saying, well, it's a global action, so we need to decide globally, and how much do you listen to the local voice? And if some of you follow the climate discussion, you have that these days a lot about nature-based solution. How much do you follow those approaches, and what does it mean for local communities? So who decides? Is it at national level? Is it at continental level? Should it be at global level? Who is legitimate to make that decision? What's the legitimacy criteria? What are the ethical principles and standards that should guide this decision? There you come to your tension. Is it a sense of urgency? Is it also taking into account other non-human perspectives, future generations? And how do you make sure that these voices are actually the voice of those non-human or future generations, and not just the voice of current people, like projecting what they think? And whose standards? Because usually we talk about big standards. As I say, we discussed this at COP Biodiversity. It's a COP. It's 190 whatever number of countries trying to make a consensus. And as you can imagine, even though on paper every country is equal, the reality is you have a lot of the geopolitical tension that play there. So how do we make this decision to be fair for those countries? And we've seen in the last 3 COPs, African voices, African country being really strong of saying, well, we are bearing the cost of this disease. We don't know if we want this this technology, but the decision should really be with us. So what are the imperatives to follow? Moral imperative, saving life. How much do you apply the precautionary principle? I could have another 2 hours talking about that principle, because between what was written in the Rio Declaration and how it's been understood, for example, by the EU, there's a really big gap. So you do have this big tension of what global is in the context of inequalities. When we say, we've had a lot of voices, including ETC and others, saying this has to be a global decision. Some even calling for new treaty. Well, actually, we started in 2016 calling for moratorium on this research. So how do you manage the fact that global isn't the sum of all the local interests? It's not equal. The voice of Mali or Burkina, which are some of the highest burden countries, are not the same, don't have the same weight as, for example, the European Union, that has a lot of agency because of funding and economic relations. And if you decide, if you say it should be local stewardship and oversight, how do you make sure that you prevent ethical dumping and ensure that there's a minimum standard? So these are questions we're having, and I've been, I think it's my 10th year on the project, so I've been wrestling with this for 10 years. But if you take off the word gene drive and you think climate intervention, you will find that you have a lot of the similar thing. If we're thinking of a climate intervention for some health issues or other, how do we make sure that the global priorities and necessities don't affect disproportionately, that's a very difficult word, the most vulnerable people in countries that might not have a voice. So that's it for me. I could get on a lot more details on the engagement work and how we elicitate these local voices. So if you want to know more about that, we've published a lot about it, but I'm happy to talk more. And here are my fabulous three co-authors, and who should have been presenting instead of me. Thank you.
Well done, Delphine. Very nice presentation, and thank you. Please remember to jot down your questions for later. So I see we are exactly at 12 noon. And I want to ask Matimba Swana to come on stage. Please help me to applause. Matimba.
Hopefully that works. Yeah? Yeah, great. Okay. Thank you very much to GFBR for selecting this case study, and a huge, huge thank you to Adrienne, Julian, and Fortunate for all of their insights and inputs in refining the case study, and Ignacio and Delphine for their inputs in our session as well. So I'm going to talk to you today about robotic pollinators. And there's a whole group of us who are involved in this research. We're called Proteus, so it stands for Protecting the Earth with Autonomous Systems. This is a PhD-led initiative, and what we want to do is promote sustainable practices in robotics to make sure that we tackle some of the environmental challenges using state-of-the-art technology. And we're always looking for people to join, so this is a plug. If anybody does want to join us, please feel free to talk to me about it later. So in terms of pollination, climate change, and human health, there has been a decline in bee populations, which is linked to climate change, and it affects their health through various factors and poses challenges to global agriculture and human health. Bees are vital for producing essential foods like fruits, vegetables, and nuts. And researchers found 4 connections between pollinator health and human well-being. And these 4 connections are nutrition, medicine, mental health, and environmental quality. So we're seeing that human population are increasing, and so is food demand. And Fortunate mentioned yesterday about the growing food insecurity that's happening. And this is happening alongside the declining bee population, which is further exacerbating health issues. And a study found about 3 to 5% decrease in global food production due to reduced pollinators may result in approximately 427,000 annual deaths from insufficient nutrition, with low middle income countries facing significant losses. When it came to life years lost per capita, sufficient losses were seen in regions like China, India, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe. So robotic pollinators are being developed in the public and private sector to assist the pollination process. Robotic pollinator prototypes consist of small drones with GPS, high-resolution cameras, and artificial intelligence for autonomous navigation and pollination. Successful instances include a manually controlled drone that pollinated Japanese lilies and an Israeli startup company called Blumex, their AI-driven robotic pollinator that's linked to mobile apps, has been used for efficient blueberry and avocado production. However, there are still challenges like economic feasibility and scalability. And our research is focusing on creating polybots for almond production. And one of the reasons for this is we're looking specifically at California, and California is responsible for 80% of the world's almond production, generating around $10.4 billion annually. And to maintain this output, honeybees are transported across the United States, with 70% of commercial honeybees allocated for almond production. And this transportation means they are not pollinating their original habitats, leading to losses for local ecosystems. And why are we looking at swarms? So swarm behavior offers sufficient advantages over single-agent drones for pollinations. Swarm robots can adapt to one another and their environment, making them particularly effective in unpredictable weather conditions. Additionally, if one drone malfunctions, the system remains operational, showcasing its robustness and resilience. These unmanned autonomous vehicles draw inspiration from natural swarms and are a vital step towards developing scalable insect-sized drones capable of artificial pollination. Beyond the kind of technological advantages of using swarms, this case study is really looking at the ethical implications of developing and utilizing polybots to enhance pollination, while also safeguarding natural pollinations and promoting human health. This is our team. So we are a multidisciplinary team with various levels of expertise, and we all contribute our specialized knowledge, and we reach a consensus in designing the robotic pollinators. And this is a form of collective intelligence. And one of the decisions that's made collectively when we were looking at the technology, beyond looking at just the task, was things that need to be considered, such as the impact of UAV swarms on pollination and biodiversity, their life cycle, and the social implications. So we started off looking beyond just the task base of robot interactions of pollination and how these robots interact with each other, and started looking at human-robot interaction. And the first thing we thought about was safety. So safety in terms of could a human get injured if there's physical interaction with one of these drones? And is there a chance that this would normalize surveillance? What would the psychological impacts be in terms of isolation and loneliness in the working environment if humans are just working with these robotic drones? And when it comes to data, with these, so these drones have kind of they capture images. So they capture the image of a flower to recognize the flower for pollination. And when they're capturing those images, what happens if they capture faces? And what does that mean in terms of collecting this personal data in terms of real-time monitoring and transparency in cybersecurity? So there are a lot of arguments in favor of polybots, which include a higher economic return, increased productivity, and greater crop yields. But for who? So when we look at the social economic factors, when it comes to labor and human replacement, there's also considerations in terms of the livelihood of traditional pollinators and agricultural practices, but access as well. So we already know that there's difficulty in accessing artificial intelligence and robotic technologies and training, especially in low middle income countries. And then we started thinking, okay, well, beyond just looking at the human-robot interactions, we want to create these pollinators to foster human health and solve the declining bee population. So we need to look at non-human robot interactions as well and what that looks like. So an overdependence on technology could make agriculture systems vulnerable to technological failures and cyber attacks, reducing food production resilience for future generations. It may also divert resources from essential conservation initiatives, harming biodiversity and ecosystem health. And lastly, the metals that go into the technology could negatively impact the environment, and the mass creation of artificial pollinators would add to this. When it comes to biodiversity, the focus of private companies on cash crops could neglect wild plants and harm wildlife food sources. This over-reliance on polybots and potential neglect of natural pollinator conservation could result in not preserving rare species. And if a polybot was consumed by a bird or a mammal or absorbed by the soil and the crops, the heavy metals would be added into the ecosystem and may be lethal to humans and other living organisms exposed to them through the food chain. And when it comes to the long-term ecological consequences, polybots are currently incapable of pollination to sustain production on a global scale, and investment costs of hardware, repair, maintenance, command and control infrastructure could hinder initial developments. We do not know what the long-term impacts could be or what the unforeseen consequences are. There is a need to start assessing the life cycle of these polybots comprehensively, encompassing raw material, transportation, processing, manufacturing, distribution, repair, and disposal or recycling of broken polybots. So through an examination of the carbon footprint and environmental costs of polybots, coupled with the exploration of alternative eco-friendly options. So we need to also look at whether we could combine these robotic pollinators with alternative pollination methods, so such as managed pollinators, for example, honeybees, wind pollination, self-pollinating crop varieties, and manual pollination. So overall, a holistic approach that integrates task-led robotic design, human-robot interactions, collective decision-making of humans, and non-human robot interaction is needed, and our recommendations reflect this. Our first recommendation is around balancing human-centered and interspecies design thinking. So we need to expand the focus from problem-solving, which is improving plant pollination, to a holistic approach where we're fostering human health, enhancing human-robot interaction, and valuing insect pollinators. We need to highlight the vulnerability of natural pollinators through non-human-centered design exploration and integrate environmental, agricultural, and technological policies to enhance biodiversity with an aim for robotic pollinators to support ecological health and agriculture productivity. Our second recommendation is around responsibility by design practices and implementing them to embed ethical and sustainable principles in robotic pollinator development, ensure that these technologies enhance food production while safeguarding biodiversity and public health. assess environmental and social impacts in the design process, emphasizing co-creations with affected communities. And we really need to start promoting transparency, inclusivity, and collaboration across disciplines. And finally, provide training on eco-design, accessibility, and multi-species rights recognition, and align pollinator development, these robotic pollinator development, with sustainability and ethical standards for improved agricultural outcomes. So I think working in an interdisciplinary team has made us highlight some of the discussions that we've talked about today. So what the impact of UAV swarm pollination is on biodiversity, life cycles of the deployment of these robots, the social implications of this report, and what we are looking for now is to expand the study, so of course further research and looking for further grant funding so that we can start doing field trials to verify the system's effectiveness from a technical perspective, and then contributing to collaborate with social and environmental scientists on the wider impacts of this system. And I do want to say that we are a dedicated collective of engineers and roboticists. I know we had a picture of Elon Musk earlier, but we're not all like that. So we are aiming to revolutionize robotics for a positive impact on the environment and society. Thank you so much for listening.
Wow. Thanks, Matimba. Well done. That was really amazing. 3 fantastic presentations. So now I want to welcome questions. And I see many, many hands. Right. Okay. So we will do 5 at a time. So I will start there, then I go there, then there. Okay, let's start. I'll come to you. Okay.
Thank you. Mine is for Delphine Thesi. I want to give you more time so you can refer to the address the precautionary principle you were telling that's different from what you've experienced. Thank you.
Thank you. Please note that.
So you give chance to 3, and I have 3 questions, then 1, then 5 questions. So I really appreciate the philosophical approach of the philosopher, Ignatius, and you really highlight of what you really want to explain. Appreciable. But is it who, which, or what voice was the point that goes against the side? So that is for you. And for TZ, for targeting the malaria, is also appreciable. Those that live in Africa and the Africans appreciate that malaria remains pandemic with no end in sight. So what, is there any time specific with the target project so that we can see how it will be expanded throughout the sub-Saharan Africans where the malaria is pandemic, not even endemic? And to you, Matimba, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. And you have made so many connections with that presentation. You even highlight the tentative technological challenges that the project may present. But you limit it to only robotics, resource information. What do you think about the emission to the environment? Is there any challenge on that? Because I couldn't see your recommendation or the future research, you couldn't capture the production processes of those pollinators and what the emission will have on the environment. Thank you.
Many, many questions. All right. Let's try to make the questions shorter.
Yeah, very short question. I think for everyone in the panel, I think one of the key things I've been reflecting while the conversation was going is, do humans have the moral imperative or the right to change or interfere in nature? And, you know, like what is recognized in a lot of non-Western cultures is the spirit of the nature and environment can we interfere with that? So,
Right.
I have a question for Ignacio that goes in the direction of the precautory principle. How do you interpret the precautory principle considering this moral hazard in the sense that a possible risk is that this technology can desensitivate the reduction of emissions by other means, and how this could be important in terms of intergenerational resilience? Because for me, I think that there is a lesson that as humanity that we have to learn about from climate change. It is a way to relate with nature, and these kind of solutions can prevent us of doing the things in a way that we learn from what we did in the past, provoking this.
Fantastic. The final question for this round.
My name is Ameyo from Kenya. I appreciate the presentations and the presenters. But mine is a question, comment. You can call it a genetically modified question to Delphine. Thank you for the insights into malaria and, of course, the new modalities of actually managing. I come from a county where we recently actually implemented SMC, the seasonal malaria chemoprophylaxis, of course having borrowed lessons from the Sahel region. But then with regard to climate change, we've also seen new species of mosquitoes, specifically Anopheles defensi, originally identified in Djibouti, but we are actually able to pick the species in 2 counties in the northern part of Kenya. Of course, this is one of the regions is actually that are facing the consequences of climate change. So one of the issues and one of the research that actually raises ethical issues and work that is actually happening at the International Center for Insect Physiology and Ecology in Nairobi is a symbiont vector-based control using Microsporidia MB. Now, the ethical question is, in a setting where maybe we're introducing, probably I will call maybe new species of mosquitoes on a background of doubts towards genetically modified species. How do we navigate that? Because that remains an ethical question to the indigenous people. I'll give you an example of an intervention that was actually done in the northern part of Kenya, which is actually arid. And there's a species of a tree called Juliflora that was introduced to actually mitigate against the effects of climate change in trying to actually afforest. But then over time we've had consequences affecting the pastoralist communities, the animals, and the environment. So on a background of that, and considering that, of course, now we have emerging a burden of an increasing burden of malaria, how to navigate, new species of mosquitoes, so to say, in such a context? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we start with the philosopher, then Delphine, and then Matimba, in that order. Thanks.
I prefer a philosopher, not the philosopher, because there are many philosophers. Ross, don't be. There are many philosophers here, and I am a philosopher. So thank you very much for your comments and feedback. Voices. First, let me. I will start reverse order. I will start with this idea that humanity should not mingle with nature. I believe that that's a view, and it is both in indigenous and non-indigenous people, but also anthropological research, anthropological studies shows that indigenous people have been intervening in climate both at the regional, local, and global level, according to their own views, shamans and other indigenous people. And what we are seeing, according to them, is what they could not fix. So you have, this is another anthropological view. I'm not going to judge that, but you have both views. You have a view from indigenous people or non-indigenous people that we should not interfere with nature, and another view that we should do things, and we are doing things. So I think, like, we have to, as I said, we should not reify, we should not solidify these views. So that's on that point. The first views I don't remember, and Romina's question about the precautionary principle. The literature and the people working on SRM prefers, there's a group that prefers to avoid the precautionary principle and or complement it with risk analysis. We should do a risk analysis of deploying global SG. What are the risks of doing like a world with SG and a world without SG? And there is literature, very interesting philosophical literature, which I'm only aware, but I'm not an expert. But they criticize the precautionary principle because it ends up not giving you a good framework for decision making. And I read some of that, and I feel it resonates with me, but I'm not an expert, so I can point out which was I was. And the first question about voices, sorry, I don't remember what was the question, so jet lag.
Okay, let's see how bad I do with the jet lag, trying to remember all these questions. So first one on precautionary approach / principle. So when originally it was called precautionary approach, that's in the Rio Declaration in 1992. And if you read the text, basically it says that not having all the data, not having all the knowledge shouldn't be a reason not to act. The context of that, of course, 1992 was about environmental disasters that were coming, and the idea was not knowing everything about what the climate change and biodiversity loss, etc., will be, shouldn't be a reason not to act on that. But that is the precautionary approach originally. It has been modified, not genetically, just philosophically, a lot, in particular by the European Union, and in particular under influence of countries with, I believe, strong religious rooting, into when we're not 100% sure, let's not act. So, and we've seen some of this talk, the radical talk to that was even during COVID, should we really use this vaccine because we're not 100% sure? So this is how radical it can be. And it's used a lot in new technologies to say, oh, but we can't be sure there's no risk because it's never been done before. So precautionary approach, and the same is being said about geoengineering, because it's under the same convention, so I have to attend those talks too. It's been very often about this technology said, oh, we don't know, so let's just not even act, and often calling for moratorium. So there was a call for gene drive, and there was a call for geoengineering. And so that's when you push the precautionary principle to the maximum. And we are this weird position, because very often it it's almost a barrier to say, let's not do any risk assessment or risk-benefit assessment. Let's just call the precautionary principle from the get-go and not even consider this research. So that's, and I know there's a scholar that's actually trying to publish a paper about that, how it has been misused, in particular for those technology. That was question 1. Can't remember question 2. Oh yeah, timing. It's an interesting one because it's actually an ethical question, and it's kind of at the heart of my presentation. In terms of the science, our project, Target Malaria, has a working gene-drive mosquito in large cages. We are in the process of doing safety studies to respond to actually risk assessment questions, but it works. So if you put this mosquito in a cage, I didn't mention because back to the species, it's an Anopheles gambia, which is one of the main vector. You put it in a cage after less than 20 generation of mosquito, which is about a month per generation, you have no more mosquitoes in that cage, meaning that you have completely crashed the local population. Now, if you do this in the wild, it will be different because, of course, you have other mosquitoes that will come. It's not a homogeneous genetic background, but it gives you an idea. So it works in the cage. And our project always says we have 3-pillar science. So science is okay. There's still like stuff you could improve. There's still a lot of data to generate, but kind of science on the paper is okay. Now you have regulatory and engagement. On the regulatory side, that's where this question of urgency versus precautionary will be. So how much are they going to want more data and waiting to be able to make a decision? And the last one is engagement. How fast can you engage, and how far do you have to engage the community, and which communities? Just where you release and monitor? Is it the broader? Is it the whole world to make a decision? So that said, we hope to have a dossier for a regulator to make a decision within the coming 3 years. And then how long that decision will take will depend on this sense of urgency. That's question 2. Question 3, that was this question to all of us about should we interfere with nature? It's a really important question, and actually I'm sitting on peer review comments for a paper we're publishing that we've done a stakeholder engagement with scholars of religions, book religions and also traditions to look exactly at that, about is it okay to modify nature for human health outcome, and not spoiling the paper. But since I've been sitting on it for so long, it's actually, in most religions, you find that the imperative to save human lives actually justifies modifying nature, because indeed, as you've said, we have, everyone, indigenous, have been modifying nature. Nothing around us is natural. But there are conditions to it that the scholars were highlighting in terms of justice, in terms of access, and kind of what's your motivation. And then here, I think this is my last question. Yeah, here about the species. Actually, it's interesting you say it's an ethical question, because for me, and that's my whole point about where does ethics stops and where does risk assessment starts. It is a very important question. So the species that would be modified is a local species in a local background. So it's not introducing a new species. It's a variant, if you want, of an existing species. And so we're targeting the Gambia complex. So it's 3 species. We're not yet targeting Stevensai, but other groups are starting to work on that. And so I think it's not an ethical question. It's a very valid, and it's a risk assessment question for me about what are these modified species, how is it going to interact with the other species, and is it, if you take it off, is there a risk that other species fill that niche? And that is exactly the type of question that go into a regulatory dossier that then goes to a biosafety regulator. So this is my call back to our discussion yesterday. of how we differentiate ethical questions to very valid biosafety, environmental risk question. I'll stop there because I know we're late.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll try and answer the questions quickly. Thank you very much for them. And I think, so the first one was around the production process and the impact of that on the environment and why that wasn't in our recommendations. So it is in our recommendations under responsibility by design. I just didn't go into as much detail. And there are still a lot of things we don't know yet when it comes to creating things like prototypes. There's a lot of iteration that needs to happen, and we're part of a university as well, so sometimes we have to use university suppliers, so that's very different from what that looks like on a company level, and companies don't always share this information, unfortunately. But one of the key things about responsibility by design, if we think about the pandemic and how when the vaccines were available, people didn't think about the transportation of that and the manufacturing process in terms of how it had to be shipped cold chain and how that impacted low middle income countries. So that's something we need to think about in the design process early on before you get to that stage of manufacturing. And then the last question was around do we have a right to interfere with the environment? So in terms of almond production, we already are interfering there. And I don't know if California will be willing to give up 10.4 billion. So I think this really becomes now a lot more of a political question. And I think in the reflections earlier this morning, it was mentioned around like kind of how politics does play a part in bioethics too.
Well done. Thank you. And I see time's up. Could you please help me give them a round of applause? Thank you.